HOA power trips usually don't start loud. They start small and technical, hidden behind bylaws, fine print, and the phrase, "just doing our job." Someone gets a little authority and suddenly decides the neighborhood is their personal kingdom. Rules stop being about safety or shared space and start being about control. Parking becomes a moral issue. Lawn height turns into a character flaw. Who you are matters more than what you did, and enforcement depends on whether you're liked, feared, or easy to push around. Selective enforcement is the real tell. Everyone knows the neighbor who breaks the same rule every week and never hears a word. The truck that stays parked overnight because it belongs to a board member. The trash cans left out too long because they forgot. Meanwhile, another resident gets written up for the smallest thing. A plant in the wrong pot. Curtains that don't match the approved color. A guest who stayed one night too long. The rules haven't changed, but the target has. Once an HOA decides someone is a problem, everything they do is viewed through that lens. Normal behavior becomes suspicious. Mistakes become proof. Silence becomes guilt. The board starts documenting, sending letters, escalating fines, and creating a paper trail that looks official enough to scare most people into compliance. It feels less like community management and more like harassment with letterhead. The power comes from knowing most residents don't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. Public humiliation is often part of the strategy. Notices taped to doors. Warnings sent to entire mailing lists instead of privately. Comments made during open meetings with just enough deniability to avoid consequences. It's meant to isolate the person, to signal to everyone else that this could be you if you step out of line. Fear does the rest of the work. Neighbors who might disagree stay quiet because they don't want attention turned on them. What makes it worse is how personal it gets. HOA rules are supposed to be neutral, but power trips never are. Personal grudges sneak in. Old arguments. Assumptions about someone's lifestyle, job, relationships, or reputation. The board member who already disliked you now has a clipboard and a vote. Suddenly, enforcement feels less like governance and more like punishment. The authority becomes a weapon, and the rules are just the excuse. Selective enforcement also thrives on imbalance. HOA boards know the system. They know deadlines, appeal processes, and how slow things move. Residents often don't. Missing one response window can mean automatic fines. Asking the wrong question can be framed as noncompliance. The process itself becomes a maze, designed more to wear people down than to resolve issues fairly. Power isn't just about issuing rules, it's about controlling the path to challenge them. The most dangerous part is how normal it can look from the outside. On paper, everything appears proper. Notices are polite. Language is formal. Citations reference specific clauses. But lived experience tells a different story. One person is constantly watched while others are ignored. One house is inspected repeatedly while others are passed by. That imbalance is rarely accidental. It's the result of someone deciding who deserves scrutiny and who doesn't. HOA power trips flourish when no one questions them. Board members often rely on the assumption that authority equals correctness. If they say it's a violation, it must be one. If they issue a fine, it must be justified. Challenging them feels like challenging the system itself, which is intimidating by design. Most people back down long before it reaches a hearing or legal review, and the board counts on that. Over time, this kind of selective enforcement changes the tone of a neighborhood. It stops feeling like a shared space and starts feeling like a surveillance zone. People watch what they say, who they associate with, how visible they are. Community turns into compliance. The HOA may claim it's maintaining standards, but what it's really maintaining is dominance over people it knows are less likely to fight back. Public shaming in HOA communities is rarely called what it is. It hides behind phrases like community standards, neighborhood values, and keeping appearances. The language sounds clean and reasonable, which is exactly why it works. Instead of addressing issues privately, boards and their supporters choose visibility. They want the message to be seen, repeated, and felt. The goal isn't correction. It's exposure. This kind of shaming often starts with communication choices. Instead of a quiet conversation or a private letter, the notice goes out to everyone. An email blast naming a violation without naming names, even though everyone knows who it's about. A bulletin board post that describes the problem in enough detail that it might as well include a photo. A comment during an open meeting that's framed as a general concern, but is clearly aimed at one person sitting in the room. The board will insist this is about transparency. They'll say residents deserve to know what's going on. What they really mean is that embarrassment is a useful tool. When someone feels watched and judged, they're more likely to comply. Shame does the enforcing so the board doesn't have to. It turns neighbors into silent enforcers who notice, whisper, and stare. Community standards are supposed to be about shared expectations, but in practice they become social weapons. They're vague enough to bend and broad enough to justify almost anything. What's appropriate behavior? What reflects poorly on the neighborhood? What makes others uncomfortable? These phrases don't have clear definitions, which allows personal bias to slip in unnoticed. Once that happens, enforcement becomes less about rules and more about who fits in. Public shaming works best when it isolates. A resident who's called out publicly starts to feel exposed. Neighbors who might have been friendly pull back. Conversations stop. Invitations disappear. Even people who disagree with the board often stay quiet, because association alone can make them a target. The shamed person becomes the example, and everyone else learns the lesson without a word being said. There's also a performative aspect to it. HOA boards that rely on public shaming often do so to prove they're doing something. Visibility becomes proof of effectiveness. A warning posted where everyone can see it looks like action. A resident being singled out becomes evidence that standards are being upheld. It creates the illusion of order, even when the process is unfair or unnecessary. What makes this tactic especially damaging is how it blurs moral lines. Once someone is framed as violating community standards, their character gets pulled into question. It's no longer about a rule. It's about who they are, their lifestyle, their relationships, their reputation. Neighbors start filling in gaps with assumptions. The board doesn't have to say anything explicit because the implication does the work for them. Public shaming also discourages pushback. If you defend yourself, you risk looking defensive or guilty. If you stay quiet, the narrative continues without challenge. Either way, the spotlight stays on you. The process becomes exhausting. That exhaustion is part of the design. It's easier to comply, apologize, or move on than to fight a system that thrives on visibility and judgment. In HOA settings, shaming is often framed as protecting property values. That argument shuts down debate quickly. No one wants to be accused of hurting the neighborhood. But the reality is that dignity and fairness are rarely considered part of those values. The focus stays on appearances, not impact. How things look from the street matters more than how people are treated behind their doors. Over time, this approach reshapes the social fabric of the neighborhood. People learn to stay invisible, to avoid attention, to follow not just the written rules, but the unwritten expectations. Authenticity fades. Compliance rises. The HOA gets what it wants, and the cost is carried quietly by those who were made examples of, those who learn to keep their heads down, and those who realize that in this kind of community, standards aren't about shared respect, but about who has the power to decide what's acceptable and who deserves to be exposed when they don't fit the picture. There's a certain type of neighbor who confuses being loud with being right. They don't hold an official title, but they act like they do. They quote rules they barely understand. They point fingers before asking questions. To them, authority isn't earned or granted. It's something you take by being aggressive enough that others back down. Cruelty becomes their shortcut to power. These neighbors thrive on confrontation. They patrol sidewalks, peer through windows, and memorize schedules that aren't their business. When they approach someone, it's never with curiosity. It's accusation first, explanation later. They speak in absolutes, as if disagreement itself is a violation. Their confidence doesn't come from knowledge. It comes from the assumption that no one will challenge them publicly. Cruelty gives them a sense of control. A sharp comment, a public insult, a note left where others can see it. They enjoy the reaction more than the result. If someone looks embarrassed or upset, that's proof they're effective. They mistake fear for respect and silence for agreement. Every time someone walks away instead of pushing back, it reinforces the idea that their behavior is justified. What makes this worse in HOA communities is how these neighbors often position themselves as enforcers. They claim they're protecting the neighborhood, keeping standards high, looking out for everyone else. It sounds noble on the surface, but the behavior tells a different story. Real concern doesn't humiliate. It doesn't escalate immediately. It doesn't single people out in front of others. This isn't about care, it's about dominance. They often attach themselves to authority figures or boards, even when they don't hold a role themselves. They report constantly. They exaggerate. They frame personal annoyances as violations. Over time, their voice becomes familiar to the board, and familiarity turns into influence. Their cruelty gains legitimacy, not because it's right, but because it's persistent. These neighbors also tend to pick their targets carefully. They go after people who seem isolated, new, or different. Someone without allies. Someone who doesn't match the unwritten mold. They sense vulnerability and move in, knowing the risk of pushback is low. It's not bravery. It's calculation. They're bullies who prefer safe fights. When confronted, they hide behind rules. Suddenly it's not personal, it's policy. Not their opinion, it's the bylaws. Not harassment, just concern. This shift gives them cover. It allows them to be cruel while pretending to be neutral. Anyone who calls out the behavior is framed as emotional or unreasonable, which further protects the aggressor. The damage they cause extends beyond the immediate target. Other neighbors notice. They learn who's loud, who's mean, and who gets away with it. They adjust their behavior accordingly. Conversations become guarded. Trust erodes. People stop looking out for each other and start watching their own backs. One person's cruelty quietly reshapes the entire social environment. There's also a performative aspect to their behavior. They want an audience. Cruelty feels more powerful when it's witnessed. A comment made loud enough for others to hear. A confrontation staged where passers-by can't miss it. It's about establishing rank. They're sending a message, not just to one person, but to everyone nearby about who they think is in charge. Ironically, these neighbors often see themselves as victims. Any resistance is framed as disrespect. Any boundary is taken as an attack. They justify escalation by claiming they were ignored or provoked. This self-image allows them to double down without guilt. In their mind, cruelty isn't cruelty. It's self-defense, discipline, or honesty. Over time, this behavior becomes normalized if no one stops it. People make excuses. That's just how they are. They mean well. They're passionate. Each excuse lowers the bar a little more. Authority becomes associated with who's willing to be the harshest, not who's fair or reasonable. The loudest voice starts to feel like the final word, even when it shouldn't be. Silent witnesses are the quiet backbone of every situation where abuse is allowed to continue. They're not the ones shouting or writing notices or pointing fingers, but they're always there. Watching from porches, listening through open windows, reading the emails, seeing the same person singled out again and again. They know something is wrong, but knowing doesn't always turn into action. Most silent witnesses don't start out cruel. They start out cautious. They tell themselves it's not their business. They assume there must be more to the story. They trust that if it were really that bad, someone else would step in. That someone else never does. Silence spreads easily because it feels safe. Speaking up feels risky, especially in a neighborhood where attention can quickly turn hostile. Fear plays a bigger role than people like to admit. HOA communities are small ecosystems. Everyone knows where you live. Everyone knows your car, your kids, your routines. Challenging the wrong person can make daily life uncomfortable fast. Silent witnesses see what happens to targets and learn the lesson without needing it spelled out. Stay quiet, and it won't be you. There's also the social cost. Speaking up can mark you as difficult or dramatic. It can pull you into conflict you didn't ask for. Silent witnesses worry about being excluded, labeled, or subtly punished. They've seen how quickly reputations are shaped in these environments. One comment at a meeting, one email forwarded out of context. Suddenly you're the problem instead of the behavior you questioned. Some witnesses convince themselves that neutrality is fairness. They think staying out of it makes them objective. In reality, neutrality often benefits the person with power. When one side is actively causing harm and the other is absorbing it, silence isn't balance. It's permission. The aggressor doesn't need supporters if no one is willing to oppose them. There's also the comfort of distance. It's easier to stay silent when the harm isn't happening to you. When it's someone else's door getting notices taped to it. Someone else being talked about at meetings. Someone else shrinking under the weight of attention. Distance dulls urgency. It allows witnesses to treat the situation like background noise instead of a real person being affected. Sometimes silence is wrapped in politeness. People don't want to make waves. They don't want to disrupt the appearance of harmony. HOA communities often prize the idea of being nice, even when niceness becomes a cover for avoidance. Confrontation is seen as worse than injustice. Discomfort is avoided at all costs, even when that cost is someone else's dignity. Silent witnesses also underestimate their impact. They assume one voice won't matter, that the board won't listen, that speaking up won't change anything. What they don't see is how silence stacks. Every quiet neighbor reinforces the illusion that the behavior is acceptable, that no one objects, that consensus exists when it doesn't. In some cases, witnesses rationalize the behavior by blaming the target. They must have done something. They must be difficult. They must be inviting attention. This thinking makes silence easier to live with. If the target deserves it, then inaction feels justified. It's a mental shortcut that protects the witness from having to make a hard choice. The longer silence lasts, the heavier it becomes. At first, it's just hesitation. Then it turns into habit. Eventually, it becomes complicity. By the time witnesses realize how far things have gone, they feel trapped by their own inaction. Speaking up now would mean admitting they should have spoken up earlier. That realization keeps many people quiet even longer. What's rarely acknowledged is that silence doesn't actually protect witnesses. It only delays their turn. Power that goes unchecked doesn't stop with one target. It looks for the next easy one. The standards tighten. The scrutiny widens. The same people who stayed quiet start adjusting their behavior, hoping to remain invisible, hoping the focus never shifts in their direction. Silent witnesses often carry quiet regret. They replay moments when they could have said something. A meeting comment they let slide. A rumor they didn't challenge. A neighbor they avoided instead of supporting. Regret doesn't make noise, but it lingers. It shows up in uneasy glances, half conversations, and the feeling that something about the neighborhood no longer feels right. The Navy SEAL next door doesn't advertise who he is. No flags on the truck. No stories volunteered at block parties. He blends in on purpose. Years of training teach you that attention is a liability, not a badge of honor. He watches more than he speaks, listens longer than most people are comfortable with, and notices details others miss because they're too busy talking. He sees the patterns before the confrontation ever happens. The same person walking past one house a little too often. The same complaints showing up again and again, always aimed in the same direction. The tone of voices during casual conversations. The way people look around before saying something ugly, checking who's within earshot. None of it is loud, but all of it is familiar. In his world, patterns matter more than words. What separates him from the rest of the neighborhood isn't strength or intimidation. It's clarity. He understands the difference between authority and bullying because he's lived under real command structures. He knows what discipline actually looks like. It's controlled, precise, and accountable. What he sees in the HOA behavior doesn't match that. It's sloppy, emotional, personal. That disconnect stands out immediately. He also understands escalation. He knows how quickly small abuses turn into bigger ones when they're unchecked. In his line of work, ignoring early warning signs gets people hurt. So when he sees someone being singled out, humiliated, and isolated, he doesn't dismiss it as drama. He recognizes it as targeting. The setting may be suburban, but the behavior follows the same rules. While others avoid getting involved, he gathers information quietly. He hears conversations through open windows, notices the timing of emails and visits, observes who talks to whom after meetings. He doesn't interrupt or confront. Not yet. He's patient. He's learned that acting too early can make things worse for the person already under pressure. What also sets him apart is how little the social hierarchy matters to him. HOA titles don't impress him. Loud neighbors don't intimidate him. Public opinion doesn't sway him. He's operated in environments where performance mattered more than perception, where accountability was real. That background gives him a different relationship with fear. He doesn't rush to prove anything, and he doesn't flinch when others try to assert dominance. He notices how the target is treated differently when no one's around. The tone shift, the smirks, the unnecessary comments disguised as jokes. These are things most people brush off or doubt themselves about. He doesn't. He trusts what he sees. He knows cruelty often hides in moments without witnesses, and that public politeness means nothing if private behavior tells a different story. When he finally does speak, it's not dramatic. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't threaten. He asks precise questions. Calm ones. The kind that force people to explain themselves instead of hiding behind noise. He references specifics, dates, exact wording. He makes it clear that someone is paying attention, and that alone changes the dynamic. People who rely on intimidation don't know what to do with calm resistance. They're used to emotion, fear, apologies, silence. They aren't prepared for someone who isn't impressed and isn't reactive. The SEAL's presence disrupts the script. The usual tactics don't land. The performance falls flat. He also understands timing. He doesn't step in to be a hero. He steps in when it matters most, when his involvement shifts pressure away from the target and onto the behavior itself. He knows how to redirect attention without escalating conflict. That skill comes from experience, not instinct. What surprises the neighborhood most is that he isn't acting out of anger. He isn't offended on his own behalf. He's responding to imbalance, to unfairness, to a misuse of authority that he recognizes immediately. For him, this isn't personal. It's principle, and principle doesn't need an audience. Those who underestimated him often realize too late that quiet doesn't mean passive. Observant doesn't mean indifferent. The SEAL next door didn't miss a thing. He just waited until the moment when seeing everything became enough to change how the story unfolds. Bullies operate on prediction. They believe they understand how people will react, how far they can push, and where the line is before consequences appear. Most of their confidence comes from repetition. They've done this before and gotten away with it. They've seen people shrink, apologize, move, or go quiet. That history convinces them the outcome is fixed. That power always bends in their favor. What they rarely account for is disruption. Someone who doesn't follow the script. Someone who doesn't respond with fear or submission. Consequences become unthinkable because they've never experienced them in a meaningful way. Their world has taught them that pressure works, and silence equals victory. That belief hardens over time until it feels like fact. The first unexpected consequence is exposure. Not the kind they try to inflict on others, but real scrutiny. Patterns start to surface. Complaints that once seemed isolated begin to line up. Emails are reread. Timelines are compared. What looked like enforcement starts to resemble targeting. Bullies depend on fragmentation, on each incident standing alone. When those pieces are placed side by side, the story changes. Another consequence is loss of narrative control. Bullies rely on framing themselves as reasonable, concerned, or obligated. When someone challenges that framing calmly and precisely, the mask slips. They're forced to explain actions they never expected to justify. Tone becomes defensive. Explanations get messy. The authority they leaned on starts to feel thinner, less convincing. They also underestimate how quickly allies disappear once risk appears. Many bullies aren't powerful on their own. They're propped up by silence, convenience, or passive agreement. When consequences enter the picture, that support evaporates. People who nodded along suddenly don't remember conversations. Those who benefited from the bullying distance themselves. The bully finds out how conditional their backing really was. There's often a professional cost they never saw coming. HOA power plays, public shaming, and harassment don't stay contained the way bullies expect. Records exist. Messages get saved. Patterns matter to lawyers, employers, and oversight bodies. What felt like informal dominance suddenly has a paper trail. The casual cruelty that once felt private becomes documented behavior. Social consequences hit differently. Reputation damage is something bullies think they control, but it turns fast when the target isn't isolated anymore. Neighbors start reassessing past interactions. That sharp comment, that aggressive email, that unnecessary escalation. People begin connecting dots they previously ignored. The bully becomes known not as strict or passionate, but as unstable, vindictive, or unsafe to cross. Another unexpected consequence is internal. Bullies often mistake adrenaline for confidence. When their tactics stop working, anxiety creeps in. They become reactive. They escalate too quickly or retreat entirely. The certainty they once had disappears, replaced by constant calculation. They start watching who's watching them. Power shifts quietly, and they feel it before anyone names it. There's also the legal and procedural backlash they never planned for. Appeals, hearings, formal complaints, oversight reviews, processes that move slowly but leave permanent marks. Bullies are used to informal dominance, not structured accountability. When systems finally engage, those systems don't care about tone or intimidation. They care about evidence, consistency, and fairness, areas where bullies are usually weakest. Some consequences are social isolation of a different kind, not fear-based avoidance, but intentional distance. People stop engaging, stop sharing, stop trusting. The bully may still be present, but they're no longer central. Influence fades. Invitations dry up. Conversations shift when they enter the room. Control feels hollow when no one is invested anymore. Perhaps the most surprising consequence is how the target changes. Instead of breaking, they become clearer, more grounded, less reactive. Support appears where none existed before. Confidence grows not from winning, but from surviving and being seen. The bully expected damage. What they get is resilience they helped create. Bullies never expect to be remembered accurately. They assume time will blur details, that people will forget how things really happened. What they don't realize is that harm sharpens memory. Those who were affected remember dates, words, and moments with clarity. That memory travels. It informs future decisions, warnings, and boundaries. The final consequence is loss of leverage. Once someone is no longer afraid, intimidation stops working. Threats lose weight. Posturing becomes obvious. The bully is left with noise and no effect. Power that relies on fear collapses the moment fear leaves the room, and nothing exposes that faster than someone who stands still, looks back, and refuses to play the role they were assigned.